Words from the Exodus by Issac Asimov, Part 3. We got further into this book. We bypassed the Egyptian plagues, etc. And as we found this to be very interesting. If you want to look at what went down with the plagues according to this book, then we can leave the link to this particular book where you can sign up, then read it in your own time. But we're concentrating on this particular part because it's most interesting. Again, this is Isaac Asimov's Words from the Exodus book. And it reads, the Egyptians were apparently quite willing to believe that the Israelites had a God to worship, and were even willing to believe that he was just as real as their own gods. However, since the Israelites were slaves and the Egyptians were masters, it would have seemed logical that the Israelite God must be weaker than the Egyptian gods. This was common reasoning among many ancient peoples. When one tribe conquered another, the tribal god of the conquerors became the chief god of the area until the conquerors were defeated in their turn. In fact, many Israelites seem to have believed this too, both at the time of the Exodus and for centuries afterward. Footnote indication. And it states below, the difference was that there were always some Israelites who believed that Yahweh, or their God, was all powerful even when the Israelites were defeated and enslaved. Eventually, Israelite prophets made it clear that Yahweh was the only God and was the God even of non-Israelites. One God for all. The first 9 plagues might be considered as a series of proofs that the Israelite God was more powerful than the Egyptian gods, especially after the first 2 plagues when the Egyptian magicians could no longer duplicate the feats of Moses and Aaron. And this apparently converted many Egyptians, natural-born Egyptians in that kingdom, to the God of Moses and the Israelites. And when it was all over, they were liberated. A lot of them went with them. They went back to Asherai, or Asher, where they're supposedly hailed from. This particular people, according to what we found about the Aramaic history. And then these people from Asher entered into Egypt, and they're supposed to be part of a union blessed by God, consisting of the Assyrians, the Egyptians, and the Israelites, according to biblical scriptures in the end times. Okay, so many Israelites seem to have believed that both at the time of the Exodus and for centuries afterward. The first 9 plagues might be considered as a series of proofs that the Israelite God was more powerful than the Egyptian gods, especially after the first 2 plagues, when the Egyptian magicians could no longer duplicate the feats of Moses and Aaron. This proof was intended as much for the Israelites themselves as for the Egyptians. With that done, the time for serious business had come. Moses gave the warning in Exodus 11:4, let my people go, so they can worship God at a certain place, right? Come back to God because they were his people. The Negro spiritual go down Moses captures the significance of this by adapting the words of the Bible's simple power. There is no mention of any of the plagues, but the essential 10th and the 2nd verse goes, thus saith the Lord, bold Moses said, let my people go, let my people go. If not, I'll strike your firstborn dead. In the Jewish tradition, it was upon the night of the last plague that they became a nation. Before that, they had been a single family in the name of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who were in Egypt, nothing more than a horde of slaves. After the night of the last plague, however, they were free, or liberated, and left Egypt for the land of their own. Upon that night, then God begins to instruct Moses as to the manner in which the Israelite nation is to guide its behavior toward God and man. These instructions are described through the rest of the book of Exodus and through the remaining 3 books of the Pentateuch as well. Since the book of Genesis also contains rules of behavior given by God to men who lived before Moses, to Adam and to Noah, for instance, the entire Pentateuch may be lumped together as the law, or the Torah. Because Moses was considered the author of all 5 books, They are referred to sometimes as the Law of Moses or the Mosaic Law. The Hebrew word for the Mosaic Law is Torah, which means law. Through the centuries, Jewish scholars have studied the Mosaic Law and provided making deductions from the statements and applying them to change conditions of life. Eventually, these commentaries were collected into the Talmud, a Hebrew word meaning instruction. A Talmudic scholar would therefore be the Jewish equivalent of a constitutional lawyer. Would that be a rabbi? The first set of instructions naturally concern that very night, the night of the 10th plague, and every anniversary of that night thereafter. It begins, in Exodus 12:12, "This month shall be unto you the beginning of months, it shall be the first month of the year to you." Now, it is not certain exactly what kind of calendar the Israelites used at the time of the Exodus, but centuries later, during a period in which they were held captive in Babylon, they adopted the Babylonian calendar, a calendar which the ancient Greeks also borrowed. This was a lunar calendar in which each new month began with the day of the new moon, which wasn't a Sabbath. Okay, this is the Day of Atonement, etc., etc., for the sins of the Israelites. The time between new moons was either 29 or 30 days, and 12 such lunar months came to 354 days, which is 11 1/4 days less than the solar year, which modern nations use. Okay, a single solar, right? So basically, over time or that period, they used a lunar solar calendar. Now the seasons are based on the solar year, so that spring begins every 365 1/4 days. The lunar year loses a little over a month on the seasons every 3 years. To keep the calendar even with the seasons, the Babylonians, and consequently the Jews and the Greeks, added a 13th month every once in a while, according to a fixed pattern. The month in which the 10th plague took place was originally called Abib. The Jews, however, having adopted the Babylonian calendar, also adopted the Babylonian names for the months. Here is a full list of months. 1. Nisan, March, April. 2. Iyar, April, May. 3. Sivan, May, June. 4. Tammuz, June, July. 5. Ab, July, August, and so forth. When a 13th month becomes necessary, it is put after Adar, and is Ve Adar, second Adar, or Ve Adar. The exact day in our own calendar on which the different Hebrew months start can't be given, since the Hebrew calendar being a lunar calendar, lunar solar, the starring days shift from year to year compared with our solar calendar, which is Roman Catholic. The use of the 13th month, however, keeps them from shifting too far. Nisan, which becomes the first month of the year, according to Exodus 12:2, begins at the beginning of spring. This is a natural time for people in the north temperate zone to begin the year. A time when the fields turn green again and the trees put forth leaves once more, when life seems to be renewed after the temporary death of winter. This beginning at the vernal equinox was to be found among other peoples too. The Romans began the year with March 1 until 153 BC, and the English actually had the year beginning with March 25 until 752. And there's more information there. Actually, the Jews have had 2 new years, one in Nisan at the time of the vernal equinox, which is the ecclesiastical new year, and one in Tishri at the time of the autumnal, I don't know how you say that, autumnal equinox, which is a civil new year. Nowadays, the new year in Tishri is by far the better known as Issac Asimov, went on to explain later in the book. For that matter, the United States also has 2 new years that are like Nisan and Tishri, 6 months apart. There is January the 1st, which is a civil new year, and July 1, which is the fiscal new year. God's instructions to Moses then deal with the nature of the commemorative feast, or the memorial feast, in his honour, that the Jews are bound to for all time. The main course is specified, and it refers to Exodus 12:3. The word congregation is from a Latin expression meaning gather together. The verse pictures all of the Israelites gathered together to listen to Moses' instructions. For that reason, the word is often used in the Bible to mean all the Israelites. Nowadays, it is most often used to refer to the people who gather together to attend services at one particular church. And There's more information there. It goes on about unleavened bread. Exodus 12:8, and they shall eat the flesh in that night roasted with fire, and unleavened bread, roasted with fire, unleavened bread. By unleavened bread is meant bread made without yeast. Yeast and leaven are synonymous. Both represent that substance now known to consist of microscopic plant cells, which, when added to bread dough, produce bubbles of gas that raise the dough and make it soft and spongy. Yeast is an old Anglo-Saxon word which may originally arise from an even older Sanskrit word meaning to boil, since the bubbles that form in the leavened bread resemble bubbles that form when a liquid boils. Leaven comes from a Latin word meaning to raise, since the leavened dough rises up. Unleavened bread bakes flat and rather cracker-like, and under its Hebrew name of matzah, meaning unleavened, or matzoth in the plural, is to be found in American supermarkets all year round. A further description of the manner of eating follows in Exodus 12:11. And thus shall you eat it with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and ye shall eat it in haste, or quickly. The significance is that the next day after the conclusion of the final plague, the Israelites must be ready to leave Egypt at once and without the least delay. The picture is quite clear except for the phrase with your loins girded. In ancient times, most people, including the Israelites, wore gown-like garments, often descending to the ankles. This is fine when one is moving in a stately walk, but if one were to try to walk quickly, the swishing about of the loose garment would interfere. To correct this, it was customary to tie a belt or girdle about the loin, that is the waist, to make the gown fit more tightly and to make it fast walking or work of any kind more practical. Nowadays we wear more closely fitting clothes, and men always wear a belt so that their loins are girded at all times. Nevertheless, because the phrase is used in the Bible, we still sometimes say we will gird up the loins when we wish to imply that we are getting ready for hard work. In the last phrase of the verse, the feast is named, and it's in Exodus 12:11, the Lord's Passover, because he passed through the land of Egypt on that night and smote all the firstborn of the Egyptians. Anyone that had the blood of the lamb on the door was passed by. That's why it's called, or passed over. Okay. That death, or God in death, went on to the next house, right? One that didn't have the blood of a lamb on the door. Okay. The Hebrew word of which Passover is a translation is Pesach, and this became Pascha in Greek. In New Testament times, the crucifixion took place during Passover, and Easter, which celebrates the resurrection 3 days later, therefore occurs at the same time of the year as does Passover. The exact time of Easter is calculated according to a system that is different from that according to which Passover is calculated, so that they invariably come at slightly different times, a week or so apart. Both are based on the lunar calendar, so that they come at different times from year to year when judged by our own solar calendar. So it would be a lunar solar calendar that he's referring to, not just a single solar calendar. The word Easter has nothing to do with the resurrection, but is a pagan survival. Take note of that when you celebrate Easter in your many churches. The word Easter has nothing to do with the resurrection, but is a pagan survival. In the days before Christianity, Anglo-Saxon England celebrated a spring festival in honour of the spring goddess Easter. With the coming of Christianity, the celebration of the resurrection was substituted or replaced, but the old name was kept. Okay, possibly by Herod, right? In his era. Okay. His Easter was very, very different to that we think we are following today. Probably to do with he probably had a belief in the goddess Ishtar or something like that, where the name Esther comes from, supposedly. However, the adjective pertaining to Easter is drawn from the Greek version of the original Hebrew word, and is Paschal. For instance, the lamb eaten on Passover is the Paschal lamb, and the full moon from which the date of Easter is calculated is called the Paschal full moon. Easter, being a Teutonic word, is not found in the Latin languages which stick to the proper form. Of particular interest to Americans is the Spanish name of the holiday, Pascua Florida, Flowery Passover, because it being spring flowers play an important part in the celebration, and so forth. and it talks about Exodus 12:18, the instruction continuing for an elaborate celebration on each anniversary of the event in future years. Exodus 12:18, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread. It has no yeast. It's flat bread, right? Matzah. Until the 21st day of the month at evening. 21st day of the month at evening. Okay. Even is an old form of evening, just as morning is an old form of morning. By the Hebrew system, the day begins and ends with sunset. The Jewish Sabbath begins, for instance, on what we would call Friday evening. Is this a modified one? Because could was last chance. Sabbaths are every month. You can use the modern calendar to determine them, unlike the Seventh Day Adventists where they say it's every Saturday. It's actually on the you got the sign of the new month is the new moon on the 1st, and then you work 6 days, and on 6 days a preparation day where you do all your work, your cooking, house cleaning, etc. But when the sun sets, that's indication of the Sabbath's beginning. So the day before the 6 days of preparation day, and then the next day when sunset arrives, that's the start of the Sabbath. So that's the Sabbath, right? Which would be so you'd have the sign of the new month, okay, on the 1st, and you go 6 days, which would be the 7th, okay, and then you'd have the Sabbath. The 7th is the preparation day, and then you'd have the Sabbath, which is the 8th day of the month, right? And then you go another 6 days, preparation day, and then the 7th would be the 15th, and then the 22nd, and then 29th. And if you had the start of a new moon indication is the crescent, or the full moon. The crescent, on the 29th day. But if you couldn't see it at night time, it's too dark, whatever, then you were given an extra day, the 30th. So you'd possibly see that crescent moon, right, in the night sky, and then the next day you'd see the full moon, which is obviously the start of the new year, by that sign of the new moon, etc., etc. So it's very different to the Sabbaths that everybody holds to and claims is the Sabbath today, i.e. the Seventh Day Adventist, Seventh Day Baptist, etc. A holiday would therefore begin at evening, that is, of what we would consider the day before the holiday. The first evening of Passover would be in Hebrew Erev Pesach, the evening of Passover. Although our day begins at midnight and evening is toward the close of the day rather than its beginning, we still sometimes make special note of the evenings before a holiday. It is a hangover from early Christian tradition, which at the very beginning followed the long Jewish habit. Thus, November 1 is All Hallows Day, a day reserved for the commemoration of the saints, generally in various Christian sects. Probably originating from the Mother Church, the Roman Catholic, and everybody else follows it, Anglicans, Presbyterians, etc. The evening of October 31 is therefore All Hallows Even, which is abbreviated to Halloween. Again, we are familiar with the evening of December 24 as Christmas Eve, and with the evening of December 31 as New Year's Eve. Returning to Exodus 12:18, notice the phrase 1 and 20th. This is an old-fashioned way of saying numbers over 20. One can say 3 and 30, 33, 6 and 50, 56, 8 and 78, 8 and 70, 78, and so on, placing the units before the tens. It is still done in exactly this fashion in German. In English, however, we have switched the words to place the tens first. The Revised Standard Version Bible switches to making the phrase read until the 21st day of the month at evening. In passing the instructions on to the elders of Israel, Moses goes into further detail concerning the manner of applying the blood to the doorpost. This is while they were still in Egypt. They hadn't been liberated yet. Okay. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it into the blood and strike the lintel and the two sides posts of the door, right? Okay, so, and it goes on about that. In regards to the 10th plague, while they were in Egypt. And here, after they were liberated, it talks about the Hebrew name for the Red Sea as Yam Suf, or Sea of Reeds. The body of water labelled Red Sea on our maps is long and rather narrow, about 1,400 miles long but only 130 to 250 miles wide, and lies between Egypt and Arabia. The modern Arabic name for it is Bahr el-Hijaz, Sea of Hijaz, after the district of Arabia that borders upon it. Why is the Red Sea so named? There are theories about that, but no sure reason. Some speculate that it is due to microscopic forms of life that may have once swarmed at certain times and turned the water red. Others think that it may be because of reddish shells found on its shores, or the reddish colour of the rocks on the Arabian side, or the reddish reflection from the sky, but none of this is convincing. The name was Mare Erythraeum in Greek and Roman days, which is Red Sea in Latinized Greek. That name still leaves a trace on the map. In 1882, Italy conquered a section along the southern stretch of the African coast of the Red Sea. It was named Eritrea, an Italianized version of the Latinized Greek. The Israelites, in heading towards eastward from the Goshen, did not approach the main body of the Red Sea. At its northern end, the Red Sea splits into two narrow horn-like projections that lie on either side of the triangular Sinai, etc., etc. At the time of the Exodus, 3,000 years ago and more, the Gulf of Suez seems to have stretched northward to include those bitter lakes, forming a shallow pan of water, probably filled with reeds. It could be well to be this northernmost bit of the Red Sea, not very deep and not more than a couple of miles wide at least, that the name Sea of Reeds is applied. Having reached the Sea of Reeds, the northernmost tip of the Red Sea, the Israelites encamped, and so forth. And the rest of the story. The waters rose and drowned these Egyptians who attempted to cross. And there's plenty more on their travels across the Sea of Reeds, etc. And God provides the whining Israelites, who says, "Oh, we're starving, we're thirsty, etc." Because they started to moan because facing starvation, life in Egypt with the slavery and even with death seemed preferable for they had flesh pots in which meat was boiling or stewing. Because of this verse, people are said to long for the flesh pots of Egypt whenever they want to exchange spiritual benefits for material advantages. God, however, provided foods for the hungry Israelites, i.e. the manna from heaven, etc. Presumably what the Israelites said among themselves in Hebrew, of course, was manhu, meaning what is it? This is the reason given for it being called man, or man in Hebrew, a word which became manna in English. It is as though an English-speaking crowd were to have named the material what's it. The word whist, by the way, is an archaism meaning new, and the Revised Standard Version uses new instead. Naturally, there have been attempts to identify what manna might be in the natural world by those who were not content to consider the whole thing a miracle and let it go at that. For instance, it was supposed that some tree or other plant formed native to the Sinai Peninsula excluded some sort of nourishing food. The exudate of a tamarisk tree was called menu by the Egyptians, and some think that this was the real source of the word. Then there are some types of European ash trees that exude a sticky mass, which is called manna because of these verses in the Bible. The tree itself is sometimes called the manna tree or the manna ash for that reason. A eucalyptus tree that does the same is called the manna gum. There is even an edible lichen that is found in areas of Egypt and Arabia that is called the manna lichen. It is quite unlikely, however, that any of these words represent the manna as described in the Bible. However, the exudate of the manna ash has left the name firmly embedded in chemistry. The manna of the manna ash was analysed by chemists and found to contain a sugar-like compound which was named mannitol. The sugar it was related to was like mannose once that was isolated. Starch-like substances built up of such sugars were named mannans. In a less material sense, manna is viewed as a kind of ideal food fit for creatures in heaven. It is the biblical equivalent of the nectar and ambrosia of Greek mythology. It might be used to express anything that was deeply longed for and gratefully received. The words of an eloquent speaker or the sight of home after a long absence might be like manna from heaven. Someone tells you something and you're really excited. You've heard this and you're like blown away. Okay, it's like people saying, wow, that's manna from heaven. Well, that information was manna from heaven. Detailed instructions were given the Israelites as to the way in which the manna might be gathered, even to the way to be gathered. So allowed to gather it on a certain day, but they couldn't gather it on the next. The Israelites were instructed to gather manna only 6 days of the week. There was to be no gathering on the Sabbath, but some did, and they got in trouble. And there's more information about that. In later centuries, the rabbis deduced as a general rule from this verse, Exodus 16:29, that journeying was to be forbidden on the Sabbath. An Orthodox Jew might go as far as 2,000 yards from his place, but no farther. This distance has therefore entered the language as a Sabbath journey, a phrase which can be used for any limited distance, sometimes like the phrase a stone's throw. And it talks about Joshua and his name, what his name means, and so forth. And then Exodus 19:5, obeying God, keeping his covenant, his agreement with the Israelites, etc., etc. Because these Israelites, as we said earlier, their Sabbath is an everlasting covenant. They have to keep it for all the centuries, okay, to the ends of the universe. And there's a couple of other ones as well that God said to them. We found in the ancient Aramaic, very old, the original ancient, very old Aramaic of the Tau Esher, that these were voiced by God. You must keep this memorial, you must keep this Passover, you must keep these Sabbaths. He was talking to the house of Israel. Okay? So it was solely for them in that era. And it still applies to them today. For the Jews, it's not put on the cross when Christ died and all over. Okay? Jews often referred to as peculiar people by God, his peculiar treasure, or his chosen people. Sometimes referred to as his chosen people. The Israelites agreed to keep the covenants, and the beginning of God's instructions are in the form of 10 general rules of conduct, which ever since have been known as the 10 Commandments. In Greek, these are referred to as decalogi, 10 words or more, generally 10 statements. From these Greek words we get decalogue as a synonym for the 10 Commandments. And it's got the 10 Commandments here. Polytheism is forbidden. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Idolatry is forbidden. Making graven images, idols, etc. A graven image is one that has been sculptured or engraved, and so forth. Made of wood, made of stone. And there's more information here. Blasphemy is forgiven. Is forbidden. The word vain comes from a Latin word meaning empty. A vain discussion is an empty one that achieves nothing. To do something in vain is to return with empty hands. To be vain is to have more pride in something that it deserves, so that some of the pride is over nothing and is empty. And so forth. The Sabbath is ordered, kept. Exodus 28, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And it was a covenant, a promise, agreement between the Israelites and God, and they were to keep it for all time. Murder is forbidden, and apparently if a Jew embarrasses another Jew and he gets all red-faced, that's considered murdered. You're not allowed to shame another Jew, etc., etc. Adultery is forbidden, theft is forbidden, and so forth. And there's a lot more interesting information here, especially about witches. And it talks about Joan of Arc burnt as a witch. And the Jewish observances, the things they must do, God has commanded them to do. Exodus 23:14. 3 times thou shalt keep a feast unto me in the year. Thou shalt keep the feast of unleavened bread, or Passover, and the feast of harvest, and the feast of ingathering. This first is, of course, Passover, while the other two are festivals of a type that are useful in agricultural societies. The feast of harvest was celebrated as a spring harvest at the time of the ripening of wheat. It took place 7 weeks after Passover, so that it came to be called Shavuot in Hebrew, the word meaning week, and sometimes the Feast of Weeks in English. The actual celebration takes place on the day after the completion of 7 weeks from the time of Passover. That is the 50th day after Passover. This festival is mentioned in the New Testament under the Greek name of Pentecost, which is from the Greek word for 50. Various Christian groups now celebrate Pentecost as the 7th Sunday after Easter, the 50th day if Easter is counted as the first. Because of the movable nature of the lunar calendar that governs the dates of Passover and Easter, the dates of Shavuot and Pentecost vary from year to year on our own solar calendar. They fall sometime between mid-May and mid-June. The Feast of Ingathering was an autumn harvest celebrated sometime between mid-September and mid-October on our calendar, and so forth. And it's got Exodus 23:19, and he states, the author states, no reason. The reason for this is not certain. And it goes on about that, boiling young animals in milk, the milk of their mother. Supposedly part of Canaanite religious practices, the Israelites then be warned away from in this fashion from idolatry rather than from a particular way of preparing food. However, later rabbis interpreted the verse as implying that meat products and dairy products ought not to be eaten at the same meal. Orthodox Jews avoid this even today. An Orthodox Jewish family may feel it necessary to have 4 different sets of dishes, and so forth. And there's, as we said, there's lots more information in this particular book. If you want, go and download it and read it for yourself. We'll leave the link to it, so you can do that. The only thing is you have to become a member. There's no cost or anything like that. You just basically supply an email address, a password. Go click on the link inside your email, and then use that password, the email and password, to find this particular book or books like that by Asimov, Words from the Exodus. So we hope that you enjoyed this video, and you'll go do that and read this book in its entirety, okay, and try to fully understand what this sci-fi Asimov was trying to get at. But be wary, because go do your research on it as well. Look at our former videos on Isaac Asimov. He was an atheist, but he had no problem with religion, etc., etc. Yeah, just the reviews from other peers tell you that, you know, be careful of the guy. He had some wacky ideas.